All right, everyone, we're set to start. I hope everyone got a nice sandwich and coffee and now has the energy to continue. You probably all noticed that the climate in this room is a bit cooler than the climate in the front. Without any further ado, because we've got a lot of exciting presentations, let me introduce our first speaker. Oh, yes. Well, during the lunch break, there was a good idea that Nora gave me, which was to ask how many people in this room, with a show of hands, were actually on one of these ships or boats as a child. Maybe about a quarter of the room. We'll get a picture of people taking hands, and then later, during one of the breaks or at the end of the day, then we'll take a joint picture.
Ask who was born in the camp.
Okay, second question. Who was born in a displaced persons camp? Okay, a bit fewer. And displaced persons brings us to the first presentation. My good friend Julie Gilmour, we worked with together at the University of Toronto. Julie for many years was teaching in the International History program there. She's working on other projects. She has a PhD from the University of Toronto. And the dissertation is something that everyone here should be interested in because it's how the Canadian authorities dealt with the question of displaced persons after the Second World War. So Julie, I'm so happy that you're here, and I think you're going to share some of your family history as well.
Yeah.
So wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. This is very exciting for me. You can tell how exciting it is because it's the first time I've agreed to do anything for anybody in 6 years, so that's how important you are. The reason, one of the reasons it's so important to me is that there is this dissertation that remained unpublished, but I have a PDF of the dissertation. If you know how to use a QR code, if you bring it up, that'll give you a PDF of my project on the displaced persons in Canada. I'll put it up again at the end for those of you who all of a sudden had a strong desire to know more. But in the meantime, you can start with this. This isn't an academic talk so much today. You can find that in the dissertation. But what I wanted to do was tell a couple of stories. The first is how this Prime Minister, the gentleman on the left, William Lyon Mackenzie King, did something terribly surprising in 1947. No one would expect this particular man to make the decision to open the door to 160,000 displaced persons from Europe. This is a man who had a long history of struggling with immigration ever since he worked for the Department of Labor in the wake of the 1907 Vancouver riots. He was highly conscious and aware of how Canadians feared unemployment due to immigration, the problems that arise when immigrants don't assimilate properly. He witnessed violence and he wanted to be reelected. This man's focus was on getting reelected. And yet, in 1947, we'll see he did something really surprising in the wake of the humanitarian crisis in Europe. The person on the left is one of the people he helped. This world-weary child is my mom. Her name is Endla. And this is her when she just arrived in Canada in 1948. You can see things haven't been easy for this child, but William Lyon Mackenzie King actually gave her a happy ending, so the story ends well. Okay. William Lyon Mackenzie King had been Prime Minister for quite a long time, and one of his real talents, I should have looked at the time.
I'm looking at the time.
Okay. One of his real talents was acting as an international mediator between the British world and the American world. He was a Canadian who been to Harvard. So the British accepted him as part of the British world, and the Americans accepted him as part of the American world. And he was very, very interested in Canada's role in the New World Order after 1945, and he was very active in building that order. This is a picture of him in San Francisco in 1945 at the UN conference that established that institution. So this is a man with strong international ties and a strong desire for Canada to look like an active participant in rebuilding the New World Order in 1945. As you're very aware, Europe was in chaos. There were shortages everywhere, including Great Britain, and Great Britain was interested in pushing Canada to take a leading role in collecting resources, funding people, in order to support the rebuilding of Europe. So it was in Mackenzie King's interest for Canada to participate in whatever ways it could. The problem was, Canadians had just come out of the Great Depression. They had been very hungry, they had been very poor, they had been unemployed, they had just finished their own participation in the war, and they weren't really interested in helping other people. It was very much a let's close ranks and rebuild Canada from the inside mentality that he was looking at home. So he had to balance this international confidence with a Canadian public opinion that wasn't really interested in opening its doors. But there was a moment where local Ontario interests gave him an opportunity to do the right thing. And this is why I find this story so fascinating and important, is because when I get sort of despairing about how slow governments are to help in humanitarian crises, or how long it takes to change gears on something like an immigration policy, or how improving it seems impossible, or making change seems impossible, I remember this story. And really, the people we have to thank for Mackenzie King starting to think about this are regular Ontarians who worked in the pulp and paper industry. We're talking just like Northern Ontario pulp and paper executives. And the reason they thought about the immigrants in Europe was because during the war, they saw their employment problems. Well, Canadian men were away, so who's going to cut down trees? Well, the answer was POW labor. They were using German labor. Many German POWs preferred living in the bush to living in crowded camps. They were fed better than they ever had been in their entire life. They got to get outside, and many not only speak positively about the experience, but they came back to Canada after 1950 when Germans were allowed to immigrate again. So that speaks volumes, I think, about the experience they had in Ontario bush. About 8,500 Germans worked as POW laborers in the pulp and paper industry in Ontario. But in 1946, the British said, no, Canada, sorry, you can't keep the Germans, even if they want to stay, they have to be repatriated, you can't keep them. So these executives in Northern Ontario, primarily at the head of the lakes, were sort of in a tight spot again. They didn't have anyone to cut down trees. And the thing about the post-war world was Canada was a primary resource economy. Our job was to provide paper for newspapers. Our job was to provide ore from mines. Our job was to provide food from farms and to build hydro dams. And all of these jobs required able-bodied young men who were willing to live in remote areas. And the truth was, most Canadians didn't want these jobs. So when the industry executives called up the same guys they called up during the war and said, you filled in these gaps for us during the war with these Germans, what can you do for us? What about those Europeans sitting in camps? Send us the Poles. Send us the Balts. Send us the healthy guys who can cut down trees and solve our problem. You did it before, you could do it again. Well, this is not a bad idea. People started thinking about it, and they started thinking in terms of something they called selective immigration. They thought they could sell this idea to Canadians, that what we were doing wasn't opening the doors to like some sort of wave of uncontrolled immigration. What we were doing was to go to Europe and be the first to choose exactly the guys we wanted. Because the truth is, in 1945 to 1948, the United States doors were closed. You all know this. It took a long time to get people out of the camps. And the Canadians had been there and they'd seen it, and they knew that if they went first, they could interview these guys and choose the guys that were going to do the job they wanted to fill. So, long story short, a lot of civil servants, government officials sent memos back and forth. And they decided that this was going to be the deal. If they could convince Canadians that one, no Canadians wanted to do the job, two, that they wouldn't be faced with unemployment, three, that they'd stay in the job for the year, and fourth, that they'd only bring people who'd been screened and could do the job, then they would agree. And by the spring of 1947, they started the wave with the first 5,000 people. Okay, so that's the international and the Canadian context. This guy is my grandfather, Edward. And before the war, Edward was a farm boy who had trained as a feldsher. Okay, so he had post-secondary education, but he was no stranger to manual labor. You only had to take one look at his hands and you knew that, he could get stuff done. He was a father of three, and he was in Reisingen am Steiger in Germany, waiting for a chance to go to the United States. He worked for a doctor in a camp, a US-run camp in Germany, and the doctor liked him so much he wanted him as his assistant, and he wanted to bring him to the United States. But the US said, no, we're not doing that, doors closed, no. So knowing what we know from this morning and what we know from our own experience, that Europe was a scary place. In 1945-46, he wanted to get out quickly. So when he filled out his DP registration, he said, either the United States or Canada. And he wrote the same thing for his whole family. So when the Canadians came to Germany and started interviewing people, it wasn't the United States, but it was North America, so why not, right? He interviewed. And he agreed to a one-year contract with Ontario Hydro. Okay, so here, this was the deal. You could come, you promised to work for a year, you had to demonstrate that you would become a good citizen. Canadians were obsessed with the idea of citizenship in 1947. It was the year of their first citizenship law. So everyone was talking about citizenship, it was in the air, right? So you had to promise you'd become a good citizen. What that meant is, like, as you can imagine, pretty complicated and pretty simple. And you couldn't bring your family until you completed your 1 year of service. And you had to build them a house. You had to build housing for them in the rural area in which you were working. So despite all the years of separation during the war, because of this situation in Europe, he agreed and took one of the first ships to Halifax and worked for Ontario Hydro doing construction until 1951. The irony of his construction job is never, I always kind of laugh because the Feldshers claimed they weren't nurses because that was a woman's job. So he didn't get a medical gig. He ended up doing construction for the rest of his life, but he was good at that too, so it's okay. We forgive Edward, he worked really hard. So he finished his contract, and like other displaced persons in Ontario, he took English classes. This is an English class. What I love about this is the lesson on the board. If you can read it, it says, "I kiss my shovel, it's my passport to freedom in Canada." Okay, so lesson number one is pretty fundamental. Work hard and demonstrate that you're a good citizen, that you're fulfilling your contract, and then we'll talk, right? So, yeah. So he did build a house. This is my mom looking much happier after they were reunited again a year later. She called it the tar paper shack, but it was much more complicated than that. I have another photo I'll show you too. It was 2 stories, it had a porch, it wasn't sided, and that's why it was a tar paper shack, but it was actually quite a large house. And it gave them a base of operations in the forest, which was really important because my grandmother was a city girl. And she described getting off the train in the dark in the forest in the middle of February and wasn't happy about it. So he had to make them a cozy house. This is the 2 of them together, and you can see the quite elaborate house behind it. This wasn't just a shack in the woods he built. But that was part of the deal, so of course he fulfilled the requirements of his contract. How am I for time?
Go ahead. It's all very interesting.
Okay. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a man who's willing to be separated from his family because of the long-term plan. It wasn't ideal, and family reunification wasn't as important a concept in Canadian immigration at this time, but it subsequently became one. I'm not sure a 1-year separation like that is something that would fly today, but it totally made sense in terms of the pressures that led to the process at all, which was this remote resource extraction industry labor that they required. The beauty of this moment for me is that Mackenzie King never would have agreed to this, except that it fulfilled the interests of his constituents, the people who were going to be voting, for executives who he'd worked with before, for the Department of Labor's systems. It was all very familiar for him to say yes to these guys who had made this request for labor, and because they felt they could convince Canadians that it was for the right reasons, they felt they could go ahead and do it. And not only did they do it, they expanded from the 5,000 to tens of thousands more. And the result was my mom smiling in the last picture. And I take heart in that when I feel like refugees are being ignored, that it's possible to shift governments if you remind them that it's in their interest to bring people to Canada and to have them become part of our society. So thank you.
There's a whole dissertation with lots more detail. So we got a sampling. Next slide. Right. Okay. Yeah. And for those of you who aren't able to take the QR code, I've got a copy of PDF of the dissertation, but we can also get it through the UT online catalog. So if you can't get it through here, you can get it from me too online. Next we have another special person who's new to most of the people in the audience, and that's Kadri Tüür, who is a new resident in this building on the top floor. And Kadri is here courtesy of the Estonian government, who's paying her salary to teach Estonian language and culture at the University of Toronto. And so she's just been starting, could use some more students. Next year hopefully there'll be more. But Kadri's bio there's a lot to say. She's been the director of the Mobile Museum, she's been at the Viljandi Kulttuuri College, she's got a PhD in semiotics on nature representation in Estonian literature from Tartu University. Before she came here, she was still in a project at Tallinn University on Estonian environmental history. So she's a person who's capable of doing a lot of stuff simultaneously. And she's going to run off briefly during our panel because she's going to pick up her son Davi, who's in school here at Huron Public School, and then come back. So, Kadri, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here and for such a nice introduction. Yes, one thing that should perhaps be mentioned also is why I'm speaking about literature and about an author who is very little known even for specialists in Estonian literature, is because my BA degree in University of Tartu is in Estonian literature, and I have even had the luck of having Tiina Kirss as one of my teachers. So, what I will be speaking today is perhaps easy listening, because there is a book, again, that I guess very few people know even in Estonia. Three plays by Raissa, Kõvamees, who is an Estonian author who is also part of Canadian expat community. I will send this around, and another book that I will send around is a picture book on Muhumaa from 1975 that gives you an impression of the reality from which Raissa Kõvamees characters came to Canada, to Canadian city environments, or at least industrialized environments. So you can just have a look. And also, I don't have a picture of Raissa Kõvamees in my slides, but there is a picture of her in her old age here, and then in her young age in the frontispiece here. And there's also a picture of Raissa Kõvamees and her husband Vassel in Canada in Muhu costumes. And so a couple of words about the author. She was born on Muhu Island. Her maiden name was Raissa. As you can tell from the first name, she belonged to the Orthodox congregation, and it also shows in her plays, because being true to one's marriage is something that is never questioned. Or well, it is questioned, but it always finds an affirmative answer. So she's a Christian person, and in Muhu she would have been known as Piiriaadu Isa. Raissa shortened as Isa. And when he married Vassel, after being educated in Muhu and in Kadri commercial school, they started a shop in Muhu, which is still active, although not in the hands of the family. And as they probably knew what was going to happen, because mass deportations in 1941 also happened in Muhu. So the family fled to Sweden first, and then evidently, as they felt it was safer, and probably, I now don't know exactly the details of this move. It could as well be associated with what we just heard. The family settled to Canada, to Vancouver area in 1951, and Raissa Kõvamees had actually been writing and publishing stories about island life already before the Second World War, and these had been published in local newspapers. Then, upon arriving in Canada, she remained a housewife. She had time to write, and she wrote a series of novels, very detailed ethnographic novels, and also drama, memoirs, and she died in Vancouver in 1989. And now we're going to speak about the plays. They are titled Piiga rannateel, Maiden on the Seashore. This is also available in English. Tartu kuningas, King of Hearts, and Pärl Pearl. from which Maiden on the Seashore has been also staged here in Canada, and the other ones are largely unknown. But they are a lot of fun, I would say, to read, because they depict the adjustment of Estonian exile community in the New World. What is very characteristic to Raissa Kõvamees is that all of her stories and plays have immense amount of characters. It is impossible to follow if you're not from Muhu, because this is very important in Muhu to know who is related to who is a family member, who is not a family member, so on. So all those plays have really many characters. The only essential thing to note is that all those three plays had 3 generations, representatives of 3 generations. And they all show a little bit different backgrounds and a little bit different approaches to life. One other thing is, what is also very characteristic to Raissa Kõvamees in all of his writing is that she's very much focused on love affairs and relations. So in Estonian, we could almost say what that her production is naistekad, love affairs, love stories. And in the following, I will be focusing on the insertion of foreign language words into the dialogues in the plays, because I think this is something that actually gives quite interesting results. First, it may seem a little bit weird. You have Estonian characters, they are speaking about Estonian things, and then you get some Swedish or English words and phrases, but they have been used very systematically. I don't think Raissa Kõvamees herself figured it out, but as a reader, you were able to do this. And here are some strategies of adaptation. What we can spot in her plays. There are efforts of the newcomers to Canada to make sense of their new location and to somehow domesticate the space around them. First, by naming their surroundings with Estonian names. I think you're all familiar with this phenomenon here. And also, there is the other direction where the words and phrases and concepts and phenomena from the surrounding culture, foreign culture, infiltrate into one's speech and mind. And then a couple of words about naming. Canadian geographer Edward Ralph has said, where there are no names, the environment is chaotic, lacking in orientation, and completely fearful, for it has no humanized and familiar points of reference. So the Estonian newcomers, also in Kõvamees plays, tried to domesticate the Canadian space, the New World space, by assigning Estonian names to some of the places they want to make their own. So making place in language is what we can call it shortly. And now I have some examples that I picked from these plays. In one of the plays, there is a reference that some characters are going to a place in Canada named Konnasar, and then another person comments, well, it's not really Konnasar, but they always rename the places they go. Then some characters, well-off characters, have established a farm in Canada that they call Jõemetsa farm. Something quite difficult to pronounce for a non-native speaker, I would say. Then we get characters whose actual names are Oswald and Leontine Pääsuke, and their names have been familiarized as Nabrios and Nabrionni. So it is kind of using the same strategy as you would do in a village settlement in Estonia. You would say, you would refer to someone by his or her nickname and forename, or neighbor. And also one really peculiar twist that happens in the first play, where an elderly couple, Tüür ja Kadri from Rannamaru in Estonia, probably in Muhu, first they didn't want to go, but then they saw that all the young people who are important to them are going, so they join in. And they end up in Canada, and they're known as Västrikutat and Västrikumän. And where does that come from? It is their granddaughter's husband's name, Västrik, that has been generalized to the whole family in Canada. And then they are referred to as the elderly couple related to this Västrik family. So, again, this idea that one's relatives for the whole lifetime, and also the family names reflect this. Yeah, please give me a warning, because we have many examples here. Then another strategy is where you have the characters kind of modifying the actual American place names to sound more Estonians, more Estonian. Kuldsepad elavad Gladstone'is, they live in Gladstone. Or then the place names Hawaii and Acapulco pop up in several places. And here I have underlined this form. Kuhu sa tahad sõita, Hawaii'sse näituseks, Hawaii'sse või Acapulco, seal käivad nüüd kõik need ja teised. And this is the short, strong inessive that is normally used in Estonian only in case of very old place names. Tallinna, Jõhvi, Koguva. And then they, instead of saying Acapulco'sse, he uses the same kind of grammatical structure to domesticate the exotic name of Acapulco, where he would like to go. But of course, his spouse disagrees strongly. Then some loan words that we could cover here. In the first play, when the old couple is discussing whether to flee or not, the old man says, "Oh, but I have been in Sweden. I have been in Sweden before. We once went to smuggle Sprite there." And then he kind of spills out this Swedish loan words, flicka, fru, nej, inte, and also the combination lahja dricka, not very strong drink. So this is the connection to Sweden, but this is a brief one. But quite generally, what else we can see in this place is loan words are used to indicate phenomena that are foreign to peasant culture from which the characters come from, and also there are indications that youth culture is taking much from the local English culture already in 1950s. So there is this two-directional tension. First, domesticating the foreign land by naming and renaming it, and also, from the other side, adapting one's own language to the local conditions. Because even if it is only the youngsters who speak to their parents in part English or broken English, the older people all understand this. There is no other possibility. So, for example, there is a youngster who replies to the calling of his mom, "Mom, what's the matter with you? Ma olen siin." And of course, Mom understands. And then here is the place where I need your help, because there in the next part of the dialogue, a fancy house is described that has a swimming pool, but what is ooken? I have no idea.
Okay.
What is that? Okay, we can discuss this later, but it probably needs to be some house type of housing. And then, of course, Tõnu sai isalt graduation kingiks kaari. That's very fancy. And then also, there is youth culture that comes in. There is a dialogue between a granddaughter and grandma, and then, well, I will just read it. Vanaema, miks oled sa nii old-fashioned, sa ei ela enam Eestis. Siin ei ole tähtis, mis teine sinust arvab. Peaasi, et sa ise end tunned comfortable. Sa peaksid nägema Penny Brandit. Mulle tuletab see leidi meelde muinasjutu kolli. Pidudel aga tantsid Brandy veel makalt rock'n'rolli. Yeah, it is actually a very igniting speech, and the granny actually turns to her youth at the end of this play. And then another discussion between the same characters about a young man who the granny doesn't really like. He says he looks like hippie. Oh, he has a beard. Well, it's fashionable. Grandpa also had a beard, but he wasn't a hippie. Kus seda? Palus nüüd kellelgi aega hippie olla. So this hippie concept is something that is also intergenerationally discussed. So it's not only on the level of language or words or vocabulary, it's also on the level of concepts. And then also there are some misunderstandings in this place. The granddaughter asks if this guy käis sinuga steady, and the grandma misunderstands this because what aunt are you talking about? No, steady on see käinud ühega. So, okay. And we will skip the kidnapping part. You can read it yourselves. Then we have some examples where people who are already established themselves, they have built a house where there is a living room, a phenomenon that you don't have in traditional peasant houses. And also another thing, there is one lady who comes to her friend and says, I wanted to show you my new wig. And wig is something that again is a phenomenon missing in traditional peasant culture. So, and as is champagne, and also Kõvamees has written parts of her text in lyrics. So here, instead of using the regular Estonian form champagne or shampoos, she uses the Anglophone version of the drink, champagne, and rhymes it with vein. So very nice. And so this is just a selection of words that appear in English in these texts. And again, these are something that you wouldn't have really words for in pre-war Estonia if you were living in rural areas and you didn't come into contact with these phenomena on a daily basis. Swimming pool, wig, beauty shop, drugstore, graduation, trip, safety VEMU. That is a combination. Well, VEMU is a familiar thing, but that you have a car and there is a safety VEMU. So this is a different thing. Okay, so I think this is where we will stop. I have one slide on theory, but we can leave it for later. So this is what I have to say. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
You're going to have to rush off. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, in that case, does anyone have any quick questions for Kadri before she rushes off to fetch Davi? Who's in first grade, right? 6-year-old.
I'm just wondering, why do you use the word peasant instead of farmer or something like that? Is that, is it a polarization from aristocrat or what?
I think in Estonian context, I would rather use the word peasant than a farmer, because, again, I guess this is a question for agrarian historians, but I would say farmer is more like an entrepreneur, and peasant is someone who is living off the land. And I would say most of the Estonians still, the small farmers, especially in coastal areas, they were more peasants than entrepreneurs and farmers.
And fishermen.
And fishermen, of course, yeah.
Peasant would cover both someone who farms and someone who fishes. Farmer doesn't describe a fisherman.
Yeah, a fisherman can be a peasant, yeah. Thank you, thanks for helping me out.
Okay, shall we move on then? And we'll see you later. And now we have someone who needs no introduction. Tiina Kirss, who I first met in Metsa Ülikool at the end of the 80s, and I think everyone who experienced Tiina's lectures at Metsa Ülikool were immediately taken in and blown away by her wonderful lectures which were always terribly complicated and about books that we hadn't read, but they still sounded really, really fascinating and interesting. But Tiina, as most of you know, has a PhD from the University of Michigan in comparative literature. She taught here at the University of Toronto, and for now nearly 20 years she's been working and living in Estonia. She's been teaching at Tartu University, at Tallinn University, and is also at the Estonian Literary Museum. So she's going to be speaking about life stories, memory, trauma. Those are the things that she's been writing and studying about for many years. And some of you have, I think, been in some of her workshops and seminars before. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Tiina back. So.
Thank you, Anders, for the introduction. And I don't have any slides. I will hopefully rely on my voice to help bring some images in front of your eyes. And as you will see, as I begin, there are a number of links between what I have to say and the film that we saw at the close of the first block today. I've titled my talk in a fashion that may conjure up the message of great theory, from traumatic memory to post-memory, life stories of the Great Escape in 1944. And I think you'll see that that title refers more to some questions I will raise that have no good answers. Hopefully the answers to those questions will come from looking at the exhibition that is up, and also from the events that are transpiring over the course of the next couple of days. But particularly the exhibition is an answer to some of the questions that I'm going to raise. But where I'd like to begin is when I was living in Mainz in Germany on an academic exchange many years ago, very many years ago. You can calculate my age from this. I was a graduate student in 1987 and 1988. And since I was living in Germany for a time period, I decided it would be interesting to try to trace part of my parents' journey as DPs. My parents both, they were separately, fled Estonia for Germany and had completely different trajectories through the next 5 years of their lives. They met in the Baltic University in Bindeberg, which is one of the places I visited. And so my area, my orbit of interest when I was going on this journey was the Hamburg area, and particularly the place where the Zoolager used to be, near the zoo, which is where my parents lived. And then also Bielefeld, which is on the outskirts of Hamburg, which is where the Baltic University was located. It was its second location. The first was in the Museum for the History of Hamburg, which was more in the center of town. And I remember when I went into these places, I would say to people, meine Eltern waren Flüchtlinge nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg. My parents were refugees after the Second World War. I was very young and naive at the time. I thought that this was a relatively neutral statement. But in the years since then, when I've read and discovered story upon story, I realized this is really not the kind of news that even a German at that time would be very interested in welcoming. Because it was not long before that the numbers and thousands of refugees in Germany were referred to as verfluchte Ausländer, the damned refugees, the damned foreigners. So I asked this question, and I was gratefully shown around what people knew of the place. Bielefeld was a series of barracks that was occupied at the time by military, but I didn't learn very much about the context except from what I had along from home. One of the places I didn't go on that journey was to Gotenhafen, alias Gdynia, where my mother, in the September days of 1944, was rescued from the ruins of a ship that you heard about in the film called the Moero. And she was rescued from that ship, and as a nurse, she had secured passage for her family on the boat, her parents, her brother and her brother's bride, and they all jumped into the water at the same time when the ship was going down on this brilliant sunlit day at 11:30 in the morning. What I have left from that story is a tiny little relic, if you're going to call it that. It's a little piece of a watch band that was salted through, and attached to the watch band is the face of the watch, and the face of the watch stopped at 11:30. So when she hit the water, that watch froze the time, and that's the only piece of any possessions that she had when she was rescued. Because I believe that the woman in the film stated that the people that were rescuing the people who were in the water were not larger ships that were moving in convoy with the Moero, but rather they were the smaller accompanying ships, the torpedo carriers or the mine trailers that picked up people and then transferred them to a later more hefty vessel. But my mother told this story about how there was a very overburdened boat, a sort of float that was covered over with passengers, and she could only grab onto the rope alongside this rescue ship. And she tied the rope around her wrist and saw, one after the other, her mother let go of the rope, her brother let go of the rope, and her brother's bride let go of the rope. She never saw what happened to her father. And then she passed out. And the next thing she knew was she was on a boat, she was at the bottom of the boat, and she was not able to stand up. She was brought to Gotenhafen. She was given a very small document, about half of an A4 page, typewritten, that indicated which Feldkommando had rescued this person. That the person was found in an unconscious state, without any clothing, and their baggage had gone missing. The language is very stark. And then this little piece of paper was her identity paper for the next long while. But she spent the first 6 weeks of her time in Germany in a hospital in Gdynia, trying to gain her footing again. She wasn't able to walk, whether it was an effect of nervous shock or whether it was a some other kind of defect that had struck her. But then when she recovered enough to be of useful labor, she was sent, being trained as a nurse midwife, she was sent to the town of Künzelsau in Baden-Württemberg in south central Germany, where she worked until October of 1945. And in the meantime, she tried every way she could to track down information about her father, and never ever quite gave up. She thought that perhaps her father had been rescued from the ship, but maybe by another boat, and had made his journey in Germany in a different fashion, and she hoped she could find him. So I was told this story when I was 4 years old, and when I try to reconstruct it, of course, a child that young doesn't really remember the circumstances of the telling of the story, but it maybe, quite possibly, was around this time of year, during the time when the anniversary of this event came to her mind. And I remember thinking about this as one of the examples of a story that was, again, a narrow escape. It really was a great escape for my mother, and one that was burdened, unfortunately, with a great deal of psychological baggage, if you want to call it that, or the sense of, I think a lot of traumatized people often have, is a sense of survivor's guilt. Why did I have to be saved when my whole family died, and they died because of me, because I was the one that got passage on the ship for them, because of her connections as a nurse. So I think this sort of background of survivor's guilt was there for her throughout her life. She died in 1980. By that time, the story had been firmly transferred to both myself and my brother. We both knew the story. We had asked questions about it, but it was a painful story to ask questions about. My father's story, which I won't retell here, was a story of adventure. It was a story of narrow escapes, but also of a sort of lucky journey. Getting on the train just before the commission for mobilization got to him. They had already come to his workplace, but he was on the platform, and he got on a train at exactly the right time to escape this. So his story is a story of this kind of fortunate or lucky escape. But my mother's story was the dark one in the family. And it was only many years later that I remembered another aspect of her story, and that was that she would often complain when she was knitting. She did a lot of handcraft, and she was knitting in particular. Her right hand would go numb and would bother her at night as well. And it was only many, many years later that I thought that there might be possibly an association between a tight rope around your wrist for 8 hours in the icy water of the Baltic Sea that may have produced that sort of phantom nervous reaction. One can never be sure, and the answer to the question really at this point is less than significant, but at the time it was a symptom, it was something that kept coming back. I've spent a lot of my time in the last 20 years, and a little bit longer than that, working with people in writing and remembering their life stories. I don't know exactly where the impulse came from to do this, but I know that there were two sort of extenuating circumstances that brought it to mind. One was, of course, the stories I heard as a child, and the stories I heard from members of the community in Buffalo, New York, where I grew up. And the second is a colleague of mine, when I worked at Mercer University in Georgia, about 150 kilometers south of Atlanta. And I had a colleague who was an African-American studies scholar who worked closely with her community in the Mercer, in the Macon, Georgia area. And she would organize what she called storytelling concerts, where elderly people in the community would stand up and tell their stories to an audience of people who were well disposed to hear them, because there were enough analogies among them of these same kinds of stories that they would be a good audience. And when I heard Catherine working with the storytelling concerts, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to work with people in an Estonian community that's large enough that there are very many different types of stories, but people may not have talked about those stories with each other, because the groups that people organized in were according to hobbies or interests or political sympathies or other kinds of projects, but not necessarily affiliating across the strands of the family stories, and particularly the story of leaving Estonia and fleeing either to Germany or to Sweden. So when I had the chance to come to Toronto to teach Estonian and Estonian literature, then I put out my feelers for some people who would be interested in participating in a project like this. It turned out that there were plenty of people at that time. They were people who were born mostly in the 1920s, who were interested in writing their memoirs, but they didn't really know how, and they didn't really know where to begin. And so we began with a method that was pioneered really by a very prominent dramatist and drama director in Estonia named Merle Paruso, who's worked with a lot of different kinds of topics, including the one of flight into exile. And her philosophy of the life history involved remembering pictures, remembering memory images, and trying to go back as far as possible to what was the earliest memory image that a person had, and to then begin to reconstruct episodes in life. And to make a long story short on that score, the group continued. They developed social bonds that for many of them did not exist with the same people. They maybe hadn't even heard of each other, even though they lived right here in Toronto and went to the same February 24th celebrations, even went to the same Christmas celebrations, but they didn't know each other. And the bonds that developed then extended into this process of writing at home and then delivering parts of the story in a Wednesday morning workshop that we held with coffee and cake. And people really enjoyed doing the work of writing at home and then coming to share the stories. Some of the stories of the departure from Estonia, of flight from Estonia, were very tragic, and it took some time for people to come to the place where they wanted to tell that story. And there was one story in particular, a woman writing about her time during the war, and she was in Tallinn at the time of the March 1944 bombings, the 9th of March, the huge bombing of Tallinn. And she told the story many times up to that point. She would say, this was what happened on the 9th of March, and we were all in this bomb shelter, and there were 2 waves of bombings that came across. But then she would stop the story at that point. And one day, about 5 years after she had joined the group, she decided to tell the rest of the story. It involved her 8-year-old brother, who had gone in the interval between the 2 large waves of bombing, had gone to check on the grandfather. And the grandfather had stayed inside the apartment building during the bombings. He was one of these intrepid people that I knew many of them. My father was one of them. That is, if the bomb is going to come for me, it's going to come for me. But I'm just, meanwhile, going to carry on what I'm doing. And so grandfather was in the apartment building. The little boy went to check on him, and on the way back, he was killed when the bombs fell the second time. And that was a 5-year interval in a trusting environment of people with similar backgrounds and experiences that she felt like she was ready to tell that story. And this is why I gave my title of the talk of traumatic memory, because there were many traumatic elements that we caught in the film that we saw. And in the course of working with life stories and putting together a volume of the stories of departure from Estonia entitled Rändling to the Pesad, The Flight of Migrating Birds, published it in 2007 in Estonia. In Estonian, it's to this point not yet translated into English, and I don't know if it will be, because it takes a lot of work to do that. But at any rate, in those stories, there were very many pieces of loss, of courage that was met with circumstances that were overwhelming, and of people simply not being able to be strong enough to survive. And I think stories like my mother's were not stories of courageous survival. They weren't seen as signs of courageous survival. Stories of courageous survival were people who persisted in the DP camps, in creating enough wealth for themselves that they would feel comfortable taking on other challenges, such as applying for immigration, being daring enough to brave their bad English to be able to take on these challenges. People who still had enough of their psychology intact to take steps of entrepreneurship even. But people who were traumatized by the war were either traumatized so deeply that it took them years and years to figure out what it was that they had lost, or there were people for whom there was no footing for the Estonian expression of dubli, being plucky, being able to take on challenges, didn't make any sense for their particular kind of experience. And I'll just give you two very, very brief examples that I've found recently as I've spent the last month sitting in the Estonian National Museum and working through their archive of Estonian stories of flight and time in the DP camps, and also time in Sweden. It's quite evenly divided between Swedish and German examples. And one of them is a girl named Aino, who was born in 1930, who was able to brave the seas of the 20th of September, the large storm that hit in the Baltic Sea. Their boat, her stepfather was at the helm, and she was traveling with her mother and her 4-year-old sister and her 2-year-old brother. And they were able to make it despite this storm, not to Sweden, where they were thinking of going, but they were blown off course to the Åland Islands, and then had to be cared for in secret, because at that point the deal between Finland and the Soviet Union was such that such people would have had to have been repatriated immediately. But what traumatized Aino was the fact that she was in the boat and she had her hand underneath her, and the boat was leaking, so there was water in the bottom of the boat, but they also had with them not normal gasoline, but airplane fuel. And this airplane fuel leaked out of its canister, creating a toxic combination of chemicals. And so she had her hand in this liquid for hours and hours, about two days of passage. And when they arrived in Åland, it was clear that her hand was gangrenous and needed urgent medical care. But nobody dared give her any kind of medical assistance because they were afraid of the Soviets. So some elementary care was given, first aid care was given by a nurse, but then she was, when they were transferred to Stockholm, they were able to make the journey in the same boat on to Stockholm. Then she got proper medical care, but ended up with a hand that was full of adhesions, and it didn't, and as a young girl growing up, as you know, in teenage years, how your arm looks is very important, because otherwise you're wearing long sleeves all the time. But the trauma for her was embedded in her body. In the larger frame of things was fortunate, because everyone who had any close relationship with her survived that storm. But for her, it was working with this small trauma. And two other traumas, and I'll leave you with this thought and one question. The second story that I read when I was looking into the Estonian National Museum archives was the story of a woman named Maimo, who was born in 1913, and she fled. Her husband had become separated because of the war. He was mobilized, so she and her 4-year-old and her 2-year-old child fled together. The flight across the waves was peaceful enough, but then they ended up being shipped off to Czechoslovakia, to a place called Maria Schein, a small village. And there were many refugees that had been gathered, had been sent there of various kinds, various backgrounds, various nationalities. And there were wave upon wave of contagious diseases that afflicted little children. So first there was a wave of measles, then there was a wave of whooping cough. After that there was a wave of chickenpox. And then while the children were still afflicted with chickenpox, covered with pox, the people in the local hospital thought it was really important to get these children clean. So they put them in a bath, where of course they caught cold, And so the younger child died in the early days of March in 1945, and was buried in a grave that was marked hastily and not very richly, and that woman never recovered from that trauma of a loss of her child. And the third example, and this is the one I'd like to leave you with along with my question, is the story that I was reading of a family that, again, was making the rounds of these different locations, stops along the way in the DP camps. And someone mentioned a woman named Mrs. Tüür, that they had known in passing, as acquaintances more than friends, anybody before. And she also was alone with 2 children, small children. And she was struggling. The impression in the story was that she was having a very rough time. She was being shipped from place to place. She didn't have the address of anyone close to her or friends that she could stay with. And so she kept on trying to be Tüür, to kind of overcome, to endure. And the next time that Mrs. Tüür is mentioned in the story is that she simply got too sick and died, leaving her children as orphans. So for me, reading with the view of a person who's worked with life stories, this is the little blip on the screen. This is a tiny little marker of a person whose name was so common that nobody probably knew how to connect with her. And she simply falls into the realm of forgetting. She simply gets forgotten. And my question that I'd like to leave you with, and I think this conference is in part a positive answer to this question, is what happens after testimony? What happens when there are no longer any people who actually went through the distance, the travel, the flight, the great exodus, the great flight? What happens in the transmission of that memory as the oldest of the generations have already passed? The people that were in my Life Histories group in Toronto, only a very few of them are still with us. And they were able to transmit their story, not just within their family, but within the community. What strategies do we have in place to ensure that the stories get told and retold? So what is the pathway from traumatic memory to post-memory? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tiina. I think you're very right. This conference is a partial answer to that question. We'll have lots of chances to speak more with Tiina in 48 hours when she will be the keynote speaker for the Dr. Velloso's Memorial Lecture, which will be taking place here at this podium in 48 hours. So this was just a kind of a warm-up. Her serious big talk is coming then.